Hello and welcome. This is video number 11 in a 13-part series about World War II. In this video, we're going to look at the, the victory in Europe for the Allied side, starting with information about the D-Day invasion. Hopefully you find this helpful and informative to understanding how the conclusion to the war in Europe came to an end. Let's get started. So with that, we'll go ahead and talk about some of the key aspects of concluding the war in Europe. Now, what we'll look at here in this video is most specifically the plans to invade Europe from England. One of the real challenges in this war up to this point, and by this point we're talking about getting into 1943 and into 1944, was that Germany had mainland Europe pretty well in hand, pretty strong fortifications along the border areas, especially in France, making getting into Europe to start chipping away at what they had pretty difficult. And that's part of why there was the North Africa campaign. That's part of why getting into Italy was important. That's part of why the Germans not being able to really end the Soviet ability to hang on to the city of Stalingrad would all be important and ultimately play a role in this war coming to an end. But more directly, one of the big things that needed to happen was getting into France and starting to chip away at what Germany held in that position. Now, even though it had been desired, really from the time France fell, to get back in and retake France and push Germany back, the reality of that being able to happen was something quite different. Now, plans for the invasion that would eventually take place actually got started as early as 1943. So one thing about the invasion into Europe that would go into France, that was not something that was put together quickly. That was something that had a lot of planning, a lot of preparation, and it was one of those things that I imagine they figured they were going to get one shot at it, and if they weren't able to pull it off, that was going to be potentially very disastrous. So they definitely wanted to get it right and also go when the time was right. Now, preparations were effectively ready by May of 1944, and then it was really just a matter of executing those plans and actually finding the time to do that. Now, I did put one example of just to point out how extensive these plans were for an invasion of Europe. Not only did they do their regular planning and build up of weapons and just materials and men that they would need for this invasion, but they wanted the Germans to not know about it as much as possible and to potentially confuse them with any kind of eavesdropping that they were maybe doing. And so they actually even went so far as to create a dummy army and a dummy base. The picture up there is showing a balloon shaped like a tank, so that overhead pictures that or overhead views that the Germans might be able to get by plane would have it look like there were maybe materials being assembled someplace. That would lead them to think that if there was going to be an invasion, it was going to be happening in a particular place that wasn't actually the place. So at any rate, these were extensive plans. Now, the code name for what would be commonly referred to as the D-Day invasion was Operation Overlord. Operation Overlord would begin on June 6, 1944. D-Day is what it's often called. It's got kind of an interesting look to it. It just represents designated day, the designated day for the invasion. And I know the picture is a little bit small, but you can see that there's just basically an area of beach or beaches where the Allies were going to land. And this was definitely an Allied effort. This wasn't just one country. England provided forces. There were French forces free French forces that were going to be involved with the fighting. The United States, Canada, a lot of different people were involved in this, and altogether there was about a 60-mile wide stretch of beach that they were going to try to land on and be able to hold on to. And part of what was so difficult about this is it was well fortified by Germany. There really wasn't a place that wasn't well fortified, and by virtue of the Germans being on the ground, they had the high ground inherently, which gave them an advantage. And so one thing that was known going into this is there were going to be a lot of casualties. There was going to be a lot of loss with this invasion, but that just shows how important they believed it was, that they were willing to sacrifice a lot to try to to take Germany out and win this war. And so there were heavy losses. Many, many thousands of people died on that first day trying to land on those beaches, including about 2,700 Americans among the many others that were killed that day. But fortunately, over time and through persistence and effort and not giving up, eventually getting some areas where they could start landing more and more men started to happen. There were also soldiers that got dropped behind the lines out of airplanes. So it was an extensive operation. And within a month or so, they had managed to not only secure some area to get people into France, but also to just start getting a supply of supplies, of men. And so about 1 million soldiers had made it into mainland Europe within a month or so. And so this was definitely good news for the Allied side, and hopefully a sign of victory to come. Now, one thing that's important to recognize about Germany while this was going on is that the Soviets were fighting from the east. So Germany was in a two-front fight, a true two-front fight at this point. And so they were definitely in a tough spot. One of the last really big efforts by Germany to try to hang on and win comes at something called the Battle of the Bulge. With armies coming from the east and the west, Germany made a decision to try to push through the armies advancing from the west. Their idea was if they could split up the combined American and British forces that were coming towards Germany and coming towards Berlin, that they might be able to screw up their supply lines enough to throw them out of whack enough for Germany to regain the upper hand. And so they made just kind of one last big push to try to break through the lines, and that's where the name actually comes from, the Battle of the Bulge, because it represents a kind of a bulge in the area that the Allied forces were moving in. Fortunately, this last effort would ultimately fail, and Germany would be well on its way to being defeated. And so basically, as you go through the remaining months of 1944 and in the early months of 1945, Germany just loses more and more ground to the point where getting into April of 1945, basically Germany had Berlin left in their hands. Otherwise, everything had been lost. And Hitler, for the longest time, maintained a position of not surrendering, not giving up. There were many people in Germany, including many of his top advisors and officials, that desperately wanted Germany to go ahead and surrender because it was clear that it was inevitable. Nevertheless, Hitler insisted on hanging on. Now, Hitler would end up killing himself. April 30th is the day that he kills himself, and that would be an important moment and a big time, because with him gone, the opportunity for a surrender was finally there. And Germany would, in fact, surrender. May 7th, 1945 is when they would surrender. And the next day then was proclaimed to be VE Day, or Victory in Europe. And so by early May 1945, the war in Europe was officially over. Now, one thing to point out that would prove to be significant, especially with what was yet to come, is that even though this was fantastic to have victory, there was one person, a prominent, important American person, who didn't live to see this point. That was U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt. He actually died on April 12th, so he wasn't able to see the actual victory. He lived long enough to see that it was basically inevitable, but he wouldn't actually quite make it to victory. He would end up being replaced by his vice president at the time, Harry Truman. Well, I hope you found that video helpful and informative about how the war in Europe ultimately came to an end. And hopefully you'll join me for the next video in the series, where we talk about the beginning of the end of the fighting in the Pacific. Thanks for watching.